Peter, I'm not driving. I'm just sitting in a car in a Sedona shaded parking lot where my wife and some German friends are having a breakfast after a hike this morning. So I'm not driving if it seems like I am.
How hot is it in that car? I can't imagine.
About 94, 95, and I'm comfortable. I mean, if I need to move to the front seat and turn the air conditioning on, I will. But I think I'm good to go here.
Okay, good. 91 still sounds hot to me.
It's not Jackson, okay? It's
Dry heat. I remember that.
it is a dry heat. So thanks for having
Phil,
me on.
Phil, we probably shouldn't leave them in the oven too long, so probably should get started because I'm afraid what cooked Cushing looks like.
Yeah, you don't want me overheated, but I think I'm good. So
Well, let's get started.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Welcome back to the next part of our conversation with Mark Cushing. We've had an interesting discussion on immigration, and we ended the last segment with a unique challenge for Mark on how we view immigration ourselves. I'm just going to ask you to repeat that question, if you will.
I'll be more concise than I probably was, but I've always been fascinated and I guess ultimately confused by how a person, an individual, concludes that it's a normal, acceptable way of thinking and behavior and treating of people to practice discrimination against others by a category, be it race, ethnicity, religion, gender, whatever it may be. That discrimination is a proper way to approach the world. I take out of the equation someone that just makes money off it. They discriminate because that's what their business is and they love having money or something. But I'm talking about the greater swath of people that just fundamentally accept discrimination as appropriate and proper. And how do you get there?
Because I can think of it from an evolutionary standpoint as well, because if we go back 30,000 years or so, we had discrimination based on territory, based on access to food, based on housing, based on comfort, all those different things. And we created territorially based discrimination, where those who survived got to live where there was more food, more safety, more environmental control. And so a lot of discrimination over time has been territorial. It's been battling for space. I would suggest that we, even in a prehistoric fashion, had a caste system back then that led to different economic status. It has changed over time, and we've got religious discrimination, we've got financial discrimination, we've got obviously underrepresented minority discrimination. But I think if you go back far enough, it started with territoriality. I could argue that to a degree, the Middle East is a territorial battle, an ongoing territorial battle. So I think discrimination in many cases comes from, you're not the same as I am. And until you become the same as I am not going to treat you the same as I treat myself. You talked about growing up with Catholic discrimination, and I grew up with a limited amount of Jewish discrimination. Obviously, Phil has dealt with a greater level of discrimination, but a lot of it just has to do with people having so narrow a focus that they can't see beyond the tunnel vision that they have. And it gets propagated from generation to generation. A lot of it is can you get out of the cult that you were raised in and see other images?
Great point. I appreciate hearing that. Yeah.
I think Peter has described what I consider the superficial effect of human nature. I keep using the word human because I don't think people understand the psychology of humans. And everything that Peter said is true, but I think there is a more deep-seated reason, and that is that we tell ourselves that we're better than other people all the time. It is part of our psyche. We always tell ourselves that we are moral, that I wouldn't do that. And we offer internal reasons for people who misbehave that helps solidify why we are better than others. It's an internal bias that we do not recognize. The more we bury that bias, the more likely we are to express that bias. And everybody does it. Everybody does it. The problem, however, discrimination occurs when we act on that bias, whether it be territorial or financial or social practices, etc. It is the bias that is the basis for it, and we all have it. It is not owned by any particular race or culture. However, it is accentuated by privilege. It is accentuated by, if you happen to live on top of the mountain rather than in the valley, then you might have certain advantages. If you happen to live next to the river rather than in a desert, you have certain advantages where you can express that bias. And what we have to recognize is that this is human nature. I remember when I was a teenager, I happened to come across a section in an encyclopedia that described development of a human being from toddler to adult. And there was a section in the teenage years where the child doesn't want to be part of the family anymore. The child doesn't want to answer to the parent, doesn't want to be part of family activities, wants to be alone, wants to be in their room most of the time. You have to pull them out even to eat because they don't want to eat with the family. That's just part of social development of a human being. And I happened to be going through that at the time. I thought I was a bad person because my mother's and father's voice got on my nerve. I just didn't want to be around them. I didn't know this was part of my independent development. Every person goes through that. And I suddenly understood the importance of psychology, the importance of understanding individual, personal development. And it made me feel good to know that I was going to grow out of it, that I wasn't becoming a criminal. I wasn't becoming an isolationist. I was just going through my own personal psychological development and trying to figure out who I was going to be. And as a result of that encyclopedia, I dove into it. I didn't just let it happen. I truly actively decided who I was going to be. So it's not necessarily active hatred. It's ignorance of the effect of bias that allows us to discriminate, in my opinion.
It's a question for both of you, because I would put you both in this category that I place myself and place a lot of people I know. Namely, it's the point, one of the points Peter made about the origin of discrimination being you're different than me. You're not like me. Therefore, that leads to some discriminatory tendencies, emotions, and actions. And this is a statement of fact. It's not meant to be self-serving, but I've looked at the world this way for as long as I recall how I've looked at the world, which has been much more libertarian in this sense. What do I mean by that? I mean, I judge people by what they say, their intellect. I don't have a blinder that screens people by ethnicity, by country of origin, by place of locale. I don't judge people. I don't picture you two do that either. I think you give everybody a chance, and there are people you don't like, and you don't like them for reasons that they've earned in your view. And that earning is not a question of ethnicity, choice of religion, color, or place of origin. And I'm really focused on that element of discriminatory behavior that I think Peter put his finger on it. What drives a person to say they're different, therefore I'm not even going to like them, I'm not even going to give them a chance. I don't want them to succeed, though they have nothing to do with my life. They're not threatening my family. They're not threatening my job. They're just different. And I'm going to go the extra mile and just say, damn it, I'm going to hate them. I'm just not going to flat out like, and it is not limited to the South. Okay. That's not fair to say. There's plenty of that in Manhattan, a lot of that in Portland. But it's an element of our culture and maybe every culture that's ever existed, possibly. If a group has come in and tried to take over your country, put it this way, I'm having fun right now taking ballroom dancing, and my instructors, where do they come from? My wife and I are. They're Ukrainians. They got in. They're professional dancers from Ukraine, from Odessa. Okay, right, pretty close to Crimea, right? And they pretty much say in their lifetime, there will never be any need for them to be generous to or like a Russian. Okay. Your example, Peter, sort of to the extreme degree. They have families, members that have been killed. They've watched Putin do what he's done, and they just said flat out, there's one group we're never going to give a pass to. And we don't wish any Russian well unless they give up and come over to our side. I mean, I kind of get that, but that element's it just fascinates me. I think you both kind of put your fingers on it. I've got to think about just how a person gets to that point beyond your teenage years when it really digs in.
I totally agree. And I want to say that my response to your question was more about the roots of that behavior. But then you add fertilizer to those roots and it becomes worse and it grows. There's discussion among Black culture as to why we are so benevolent toward our former masters about how we were treated. And my answer to that is that we're outnumbered. If we thought we could win the war, we would go to war, but we know we wouldn't win. We're 10%, 11% of the country. Our survival instinct says we better get along. Our survival instinct makes us teachers rather than warriors. And all we can do is fight for ourselves rather than attack those who attack us.
Okay.
So yes, there are external influences that affect our views and our actions. And of course, those from Ukraine that are forced to relocate in places like Sedona, Arizona. I can't imagine a better outcome.
Phoenix, not Sedona.
I'm sorry. Either way, it doesn't matter. I bet you there's some in Sedona too. But I'm just saying, I can't imagine a better outcome to an invasion, except for the fact that they lost their homestead. They lost their ancestry. They're starting over. Nobody wants to do that.
Her cat is back home with her mom in Odessa. She knows every day her parents, there may be a missile that hits their neighborhood. I mean, the individual circumstance ain't so bad. No one feels too sorry for somebody living in Scottsdale.
And imagine 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, those stories only become more horrific.
Yeah.
And they only serve to feed the bias that we already have. Nobody's going to think about the Russians who don't support the war that are unable to speak out. They aren't even able to say the word war.
Right.
In Russia right now. It's easier to hate every Russian than it is to consider the political atmosphere in Russia.
We're dealing with a lot of political separation here as well. And do you hate the leader or do you hate the followers? Or do you hate them as a group?
Because and it's easy to hate everyone.
Correct.
Especially when the leader is telling us to hate.
I think you directed me to watch A Small Light.
Yes.
And about 6 of the 7 episodes done. And Mark, have you heard of A Small Light? It's
no,
about
I don't think so.
It's about Miep Gies, who is the Dutch woman who helped hide Anne Frank during time around Nazism and the World War. And it's been interesting to me to see that experience and watch how the Dutch did everything that they could to help protect others in their community as the Germans were trying to take over the Netherlands. And you look at that, and that whole era was all about territory, and it was about religion, and it was about different people, for example, the gypsies, etc. And then you start to think about all of those different things, and Hitler and the caste system there in India, and the caste system there, and our own caste system and discrimination. It's really quite difficult, and I think we're seeing it more and more even here in the United States, and not even color-based, but just people feeling that they're different and wanting to separate themselves from everybody else who's not them. So
yeah, no, and that's, we don't have, we just have a few minutes left, and it's so we could talk another time, because I think you have now uniquely two polar opposite ideological groups looking at the same issue, which is higher education policy and affirmative action. On the one hand, a group, and each side totally discredits and dismisses the authenticity of the other side's view. The get rid of affirmative action group views anybody supporting it in their own way as racist, in their own way as elevating race as a primary factor, and excuses their opposition that way, but saying, I'm not promoting in any way racist activity. I'm in fact trying to oppose it. The other side says, "Who are you kidding? What are you talking about? How do you catch up? How do you ignore the residual impact of institutional racism over 200-300 years, or maybe 1,000 years?" In other words, so in our lifetimes as Americans, I can't remember a time, either of you, where race has been such a primary topic for so long, other than during the Detroit, the 1968 era, going back to certain Supreme Court decisions, going back to the Mississippi you grew up in, Phil. I'm not trying to minimize that, but I'm just saying right now, it is an everyday primary topic. Where you come out on the race issue and how the race issue is defined, and it's so nuanced that it's hard to even voluntarily engage in that discussion, because you have no control over where that conversation is going to go.
You're absolutely right. But again, it goes to the ignorance of the origin of bias, or the ignorance that bias is present in everyone, as well as goes to the ignorance of structural racism.
Yeah.
I have talked to people about redlining, et cetera, that they knew nothing about. And they're startled that there are business practices that are based on race. And then the next day, they immediately dismiss it. They immediately forget it because it troubles them. And within 3 months, if you talk about structural racism, they don't recognize it. They refuse to believe it. And it becomes a story that they once heard. And so there is no sense of realistic corrections to adjust for the unfair practices that have occurred for a century or two. I noticed that the discussion of reparations really generates a lot of these mixed emotions. This country was essentially built on, just as Egypt once was built on slave labor. This country would not be as wealthy as it is if it had not been for the free labor that created aristocracy in the South. And there are children of that aristocracy that still benefit from that free labor. And yet, we're willing to consider reparations for Native Americans. We're willing to consider reparations for the Japanese during World War II. That doesn't seem to be such a hard thing to do. But because African Americans are considered lazy and always have a handout, welfare is our reparation.
That's a profound point. No, I agree. This is the first rational conversation I've had on this topic in years, honestly, because people just aren't. I don't care who you're with. This topic just shuts people down and just freezes people in the language and the linguistics of it. And just so congratulations to the two of you for even having these conversations. Seriously.
Well, that's what this courageous conversation is about. And we appreciate the fact that you were willing at least to participate. And I'm sure you were surprised that we didn't talk about veterinary medicine once yet.
You know what? I didn't think you would. My wife asked me about it, and I said, well, we could talk all day about it, but we all three of us do talk all day about it. And I said, I think Peter and Phil have a different goal in mind for this conversation, which I said, I'm looking forward to it, however I come across. I mean, because it's just difficult to have this discussion. And
Phil, he called us rational, which I'll take as a compliment, because I'm
Yes,
not
me
sure we
too.
are rational too. Okay, Mark, obviously it's the first time you've worked with Phil and I when we're doing this, but Phil knows that frequently I'll get online during our conversations and I'll look things up. I found an article in Scientific American called The Evolution of Prejudice, because we were talking about being different. And I just want to read a quote, if I can. I just scrolled past it again. So they looked at people using implicit bias testing, and we do that through Harvard, and there's all sorts of online implicit bias, but they did this with monkeys. And I think bottom line, across several experiments, they found that monkeys stared longer at the faces of outsiders. Remember, we talked about being part of the group or not part of the group? And this would suggest that monkeys were wary of outside faces. So evolutionarily, going back, part of discrimination started before primates, because these were rhesus monkeys. And so we are dealing with a multi-generational evolutionary situation that, for those people who believe in Darwin, actually occurred. And for those people who don't, those are the outsiders. It's an interest. I just love finding this article. I'll send you the article.
Send me a link, and I have to jump. I'd be happy to discuss veterinary medicine issues sometime, or continue this conversation. And congratulations on the program. So
Peter and I both want to thank you for spending some time with us. We understand you got to go.
I think, Mark, early on, you made yourself a self-proclaimed anarchist on immigration. And I would argue that we need to bring you back, because in many cases, you're a self-proclaimed anarchist on a lot of veterinary-related discussions as well. And I'd like to visit some of those in this environment down the road. And so I thank you for your time, but we'll find some time to do this again.
Thank Nationwide for their support, and Nicole Nelson for being our producer.
Thanks, gentlemen. Have a great rest of your weekend. See you.
See you.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.